Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Meet the Nature Crime Alliance webinar. I'm Luke Foddy. I'm the Communications Manager for the Alliance Secretariat, and it's great to see you all here today. If you're new to these sessions, welcome. The format's pretty simple. We normally showcase 3 presentations from across our membership throughout the course of the hour, and then we have a Q&A after each presentation for people to put questions to our guests. These are very much kind of top-level overview presentations. They're not deep dives, but we encourage people who want to find out more about the work to get in touch with our guests after the session. They're very much about creating ideas for collaboration and perhaps learning a few new things. So we've got a really good lineup today. We've got a bit of a special because it's a UN Office on Drugs and Crime double whammy, if you like. So UNODC published 2 really good reports this year, very pertinent reports. There's the Landscape of Criminalization report, which looks at environmental offences around the world. And we have the World Wildlife Crime report too, which was also published earlier this year. And I've wanted to get them on the webinar for a while to talk more about this research. So it's great to have them here today. And then we'll also hear from World Forest ID, who have been doing really good work supporting policy around transparency in the forestry sector. So 3 really good presentations to come. Before we get into that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Chip Barber, who's the Director for Natural Resources Governance and Policy at the World Resources Institute. And he oversees the Nature Crime Alliance and some of the teams at WRI. So Chip, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Luke, and welcome everybody. It's really good to see you all here. Yeah, this is an exciting set of webinars. We've gotten a lot of good reaction because in the Nature Crime Alliance, I hope you visited the website and have some idea of what this alliance is doing. But one of our main purposes is to connect and amplify the work of our members and partners, to let other people know about it and to connect them with each other. And a part of that is providing platforms to explain their work on nature crime and associated crimes. And that's what we're doing today. And well, before I turn it back over and get started here, I just wanted to mention that staff from the Nature Crime Alliance will be participating in the United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime Conference of the Parties, which is going to be in Vienna the week after next. So any of you who are there, we hope that our folks can connect with you. And then the following 2 weeks, we will also be at the Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of the Parties, COP16, which is in Cali, Colombia, doing quite a few things. And so if any of you happen to be there or are watching things online there, we hope to see you there. So with that, Luke, I'm going to hand it back to you to get things started.
Great. Thank you, Chip. Thanks for that update. And yeah, hopefully we can connect with some of our members across those 2 important events. So let's get stuck into today's agenda. UNODC's Landscape of Criminalization report, which is part of the global analysis on crimes that affect the environment, analyzes the state of criminalization for violations of environmental offences across the UN's member states. And Tanya Wyatt, who is a lead researcher for crimes that affect the environment at UNODC, co-authored that report. And I'm really pleased to say that she's here today to tell us more. So Tanya, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke and WRI, for the invitation. And we look forward to welcoming you in Vienna in the very near future. Can people see my screen? All right, there it goes. Yeah. So yes, the landscape of criminalization, as Luke kindly said, is the first part of the global analysis, and we will be coming out with numerous other parts over the rest of the year and into next year, including around deforestation, logging, mining, fishing, waste, and pollution. So do keep an eye out for those at our website. So just as Luke said, to give an overview of what this publication actually covers. So as I think the audience will know as well as I do, that there is really no single legal instrument that covers all crimes that affect the environment. We have this really global patchwork of regional environmental agreements, such as the Bamako Convention or the Ikazu Agreement. And then we have international conventions where we have more member states or more global countries involved, such as CITES, for instance, so the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, but there's lots of other examples there that are relevant in the environmental space. And how this works is that you then have national or subnational legislation that actually transposes or puts in effect all of the requirements of these international conventions or regional agreements into practice. And some of it is requirements, but others of it, of course, are suggestions. So there's a real complicated mix of soft and hard law here. So what we decided to do, and what we've been asked to do by member states, is a really extensive review of this environmental legislation. So we ended up looking, and you can see there, over 2,000 pieces of legislation. And you can see the column on the right is where we couldn't find legislation. And that could be because language issues, as well as maybe the member state doesn't need legislation covering a particular environmental area. And we see some overlap here, perhaps between things like soil pollution and waste violations. But we covered 9 particular areas and really did a deep dive into all of these. Of course, I had loads of help with this. I'd like to particularly give a shout out to all of the consultants that participated from Lewis and Clark's law school. So they have the global law clinic that covers animal and environmental offenses. And so we had numerous students and staff there that participated in this. One of the powers of research at the UN is our ability to ask member states directly for assistance and for requests for information. And so we did what we call a note for ball back in May of 2023. And we only had 32 member states respond. And so beyond those 32 member states, we had to go in and do the content analysis ourselves. And so, as you can imagine, this takes a lot of time. But what we've come up with then is we analyzed all of these different pieces of legislation for, was a violation of a particular piece of legislation criminalized or not? And what you can see there is, I think, perhaps one of the big takeaways from this piece of research is that the state of criminalization is perhaps more extensive than often the narrative is, where we talk about we need to be harsher with environmental violations, and actually there's a fair amount of criminalization. Wildlife, you can see at the top there, actually has the most. And this is just one offense is criminalized. It could be that states are using the range of administrative and criminal penalties. Waste is next, but then we also see high levels around deforestation and logging offenses, water and air pollution. And I encourage you, as Luke said, if you do have any questions about specific things, do reach out to me afterwards. Some of the big findings we think, though, is, the 2 you saw that are the most criminalized are waste and wildlife. And for those, we know that there's very well-established international conventions, and it looks like these make a difference. Now, of course, the Basel Convention is the only international convention that requires criminalization. So Article 9 within it requires member states who have implemented Basel that they also have to criminalize a number of offenses that are related to waste trafficking. So the international illegal movement that violates a number of detailed activities. So there we see, it's maybe perhaps not surprising then that criminalization in waste is particularly high. Now, CITES is a different one where it requires penalization, but that penalization does not have to be criminal. But still, we see a really high level of member states who are members also to CITES having a high level of criminalization. And there's a variety of reasons for that, probably, that we talk about in this publication, and one of them being that CITES is very well established, and wildlife crime and wildlife trafficking has received a lot of international attention in its 50 years of existence. So we see criminalization being fairly well advanced in both of these areas. And as the UNODC, what is particularly of interest to us in terms of environmental crime or crimes that affect the environment, as it's called here, is the offense a serious crime? And a serious crime is defined in the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, for which UNODC is a guardian of. So serious crime is then defined in there of at least 4 years in prison. And what we can see there, again, at least one type of offense has a serious crime penalty. And you can see waste and wildlife, again, have the most member states adopting this approach where the offense is given 4 years or more. And then we see other levels much, much lower for the other offenses. Why this is important is within the UNTAC, if you are participating or implementing it and you have a serious crime or an offense is listed as a serious crime, this has a number of advantages in terms of law enforcement tools. It would mean that you're entitled to mutual legal assistance, extradition, and other forms of collaboration. So this has a reason for why that the UNTAC actually recommends that member states consider serious crime for certain kinds of offenses that benefit from the use of mutual legal assistance, extradition, and those types of activities. It isn't to say that we would suggest or promote any sort of criminalization. This is just really a state of knowledge around criminalization, because we were also interested in what other sorts of sanctions that member states are giving for violations of environmental offenses. So confiscation was actually fairly limited, for instance, in water is just one example. It really applied mostly to equipment rather than proceeds. And obviously this is one area where further research, but also improvement around financial crimes is probably clearly needed. And then in terms of the environment, we're very interested in around restoration and restitution, but fixing the damage that's caused by the environmental harm. So, but very few countries, and just using water pollution as another example, only 35 of the 93 member states that we dove into, actually, we could see evidence within the environmental legislation about restoration. So there's more work to be done here, more research to unpack what kinds of restoration and what that looks like. But it's interesting to know, in addition to criminalization, what other legislative approaches are being taken. A really important area in terms of crimes that affect the environment is how are legal persons, so corporations and businesses, treated versus how individuals are actually treated. And here we see room for improvement in terms of fishing-related offenses and deforestation and logging-related offenses in particular. These had very low evidence of having liability for legal persons, even though fishing and forestry are highly industrialized sectors and likely that legal persons are heavily involved. But we see waste being quite high there. And again, speculating that this might have something to do with the Basel Convention. As an example of how we broke this down then by region, or in terms of actually sub or intermediate region, according to the UN Statistics Office, we can see different levels of criminalization. And this example is from deforestation and logging related offenses, where we see, for instance, if we just look at one example of Western Europe actually not criminalizing deforestation and logging related offenses as much as is criminalized, whereas someplace like Eastern Europe has taken a different approach. So even in an area where there is a fair amount of harmonization, perhaps because of the EU crime directive, we still see gaps and lack of harmonization, even though there's efforts to try to achieve this. So this is one area where, again, we could see improvement. Similarly, with mining-related offenses, another example at the sub or intermediate region, where we see, for instance, Eastern Africa jumps out as criminalizing with as a serious crime in nearly half of the countries in that region, where we see missing data a lot in the Caribbean, where maybe mining isn't so active, but again, a real spread and showing a lack of harmonization with regions. And harmonization is an important thing, again, in relation to us being guardians of the UNTAC, because there's a requirement around dual criminality. So if two states need to collaborate around mutual legal assistance and extradition, they both have to have both have to have criminalized the offense for that to be able to take place. So harmonization, in addition to tackling sort of displacement and things like that, also has a practical implications in terms of the UNTAC. One of the other ways that we explored the data is around a breakdown by the percentage of member states meeting that serious crime threshold. So this shows for all of the 9 different environmental offenses or areas that we looked at, the different levels across the different subregions within the regions. So if we look at Europe, for instance, you could see waste 62% have actually have serious crime for waste offenses. And so you can see the differences around there. And then we go a step further, the final part of the chapter, or this part, is breaking down in each of those regions into the subregions. So Southern Africa, for instance, you just see a really high amount of criminalization. Here we're not looking at serious crime, but just criminalization in general. There's 5 of the 9 areas where you have 100% of the countries in that region have actually criminalized, which shows a fairly high level of harmonization that I mentioned that we are suggesting is quite useful. That is actually it for me, but I just want to end on one update, is that after we finished this publication in May during the CCPCJ, we've gone back out to each of the member states, so each of the 193, and we've shared the content analysis that we did, what was criminalized and what wasn't, for all of these 9 areas, and asked them to correct it, update it. And so we have gotten 44 member states answering that. So we're in the process of updating all of this. And I would predict that perhaps we'll see even an increase of the level of criminalization that we found in this first study, based upon the help from member states in regards to this research. So I'm going to now leave my last bit of time for questions. Back to you, Luke.
Great. Thank you, Tanya, for that overview. If people on the call haven't read the report, I really recommend doing so. I personally found it extremely useful just to give us a state of play globally on what's happening around the world. I guess my question, you touched on some of this, but you obviously I think you looked at over 2,500 pieces of environmental legislation across 193 countries. So a huge undertaking. But what I found quite interesting was that in certain regions where we know environmental crimes are happening at some frequency, those same regions do have kind of the higher percentage of penalties that meet the serious crime definition. And that would suggest that the issue might not be legislation, it's more about enforcement. So I wondered, do you guys have any plans to kind of do research on the enforcement piece? How much allocation or funds are going into law enforcement across these geographies?
Yeah, thank you, Luke. No, you're absolutely right. So here we see what is criminalized, what isn't, but it doesn't speak to implementation or enforcement at all. And that is our plans for further research. And hopefully we touch on this in each of the forthcoming chapters about what we know already about sort of enforcement of these different offenses in the regions, but even we'd like to do a deeper dive and really start collecting all this data where we can find it, but it is limited around arrests, prosecutions, sentencing, and what is the attrition rate? You know, when someone's arrested, how many get prosecuted, how many are convicted? And I think those are our longer term plans for sure. And I know Kata might speak to more of this around wildlife, where we have the best data. I think is one of the early areas where we could provide some insight on that.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you. We did have another similar question around how often criminal penalties have been applied in practice since those pieces of legislation have come into force. So I guess that's another big part of the puzzle that you guys will have to look at going forward. Yeah,
no, we'll have me back in a year or more, and I'll try to answer.
Yeah, absolutely, great. And then somebody's asked if the slides will be shared. We can certainly do that after the presentations. And also this webinar is being recorded and will be on our website at a later date. Thank you so much, Tanya. Really interesting. We've got to move on. We've got 2 more presentations to come, but I really appreciate those insights. Thank you very much. And just to remind folks that if you do have any questions that you'd like to ask of our guests, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we can select those questions and put them to our experts here today. So we've just heard about the global criminalization landscape for environmental crimes. Let's now look at a specific environmental crime, which is of course wildlife crime. The 2024 World Wildlife Crime Report from UNODC presents the key characteristics of the illegal wildlife trade, but it also highlights some approaches that have worked to stop these crimes, solutions. So I'm really pleased that we've now got Katalin Kecse-Nagy, who's the Wildlife Crime Research Officer at UNODC, who helped write this report and do the research behind it. So Katalin's going to tell us a little bit more about that report. Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can all see my screen in presentation mode. So yeah, welcome everyone. As mentioned, I'm the Wildlife Crime Research Officer at UNODC. I'm based in Vienna, and yeah, it's very grey and dull this afternoon here. I hope you have better weather where you are based. The World Wildlife Crime Report, I'm going to just give you some highlights from this. It's actually, there's quite a wealth of information in the report, so I would strongly encourage you all to have a look at the report and read. It gives a very comprehensive and in-depth overview of the situation and the state of play. Yeah, let me get on to some highlights from this to give you to invite you to do this. As you can see, the report outline, we looked into various aspects of wildlife crime, really characterizing trade, the impacts and the harms of this crime, the drivers, and also what works, as mentioned by Luke, as well as some case studies, 6 case studies that actually look into those species that are illustrated in this little illustration. So rhinos, elephants, pangolins, but also some plants, including orchids, rosewood, and also the seahorses. So to include some species that are less, perhaps receive less attention. I should also say, when we speak about wildlife crime, we actually primarily focus on wildlife trafficking. This is where our mandate is, to really look into the state of play regarding wildlife trafficking. And even within that, we actually have a focus, and this is really on CITES, and so the species protected and covered by the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And this is mainly because this is where we have a good data set. To give you an idea of the data, as well as sort of the coverage of what we're looking at. The little chart here at the bottom shows sort of our data sources and the seizure data as sort of the core element of our data. And that includes from 2016, the CITES illegal trade reports shown in green. So that's really the core data set, and the additional data come from other sources that UNODC holds. And well, I mean, as a first observation, you can really see that there was a very strong decrease in the number of records that were reported during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and 21. So that's already an observation. But looking at sort of a larger period between 2015 and 2021, the map illustrates that this has been or was really a global problem, an issue with 162 countries and territories implicated and in seizures. And so really wanted to emphasize that. But maybe a little more about the data itself. While seizure data are very important in our analysis and really provide the core that we start from, it's very important to caveat and sort of recognize some limitations that the trade data or the seizure data has. So on the one hand, the issue is that it only shows the detected cases. So we don't know the share that is undetected, and we don't know how much that is. Also, another problem is that seizures also reflect on the enforcement effort. So where controls are made and then there are detections. So it also, seizures are also a reflection of enforcement work. And also seizure data are also reflection of reporting rate, because sometimes there is enforcement, there is illegal trade, there is enforcement, there are detections, but if this is not reported or doesn't reach us, so to say, then it's very difficult, of course, to depict this. The reason I'm also saying this is to explain and to put into context why the approach that we've taken in the World Wildlife Crime Report and the related research, of course, that we try to use additional data sources where available to really complement this seizure data, which comes with some limitations, and also did additional research, including our own research and review of the literature to try to triangulate the information that we're finding and to make sure that the finding and the evidence are really robust. So another finding is, of course, this great diversity of species that can be found in illegal trade, from plants to animals. And again, you can see some of the species groups that are covered in more detail in our case studies in these charts. Around 4,000 species were reported in these seizures and in our data set that we looked at over this period. But again, let me emphasize that there are some species that you can also see in some of these charts that actually have received much less attention and which are also important to consider. And I would really single out plants in this context because they really do tend to be overlooked. In terms of some significant findings, perhaps one positive news to highlight is that some of the iconic markets have been found to have been declining, including for elephant ivory and for rhino horn. This slide illustrates the situation for elephant ivory, and it also illustrates how the approach of triangulation and how we try to look at the situation from different angles. So apart from the seizure records that can be seen at this bottom left part of the slide, show a decline both in terms of number of seizure records in green, but also in terms of total quantity and weight of ivory seized over time. But we also looked at other sources of information, including the number of elephants killed. We're really lucky to have that information through the so-called MIC system, that is the monitoring of the illegal killing of elephants. That's again under CITES that we have this information, and you can see in this brown line that this has been declining over the years. And then we also looked at the price information of ivory, and again that is also showing a declining trend. So overall, these are this is why we could say that we see some progress in that regard. And that said, we also have to acknowledge that since 2021 there have been some large seizures of ivory. So it is some further vigilance is needed and monitoring of the situation before we can say whether this is a continuing trend or not. And in terms of what could have been causing this sort of positive trend that we're seeing, I will come back to this in some of the later slides as I'm presenting. So coming back to harms, wildlife crimes, these are quite diverse and pervasive. Perhaps the most well-known ones are environmental harms, but of course, there are social and economic harms to livelihoods and the well-being of people that live close to wildlife, and also governance harms, which are very important to bear in mind. So in terms of the implications of what we found in relation to looking at a bit closer to the harms of wildlife crime, what I would highlight is that there needs to be a comprehensive accounting of the cascade of interlinked harms, and that needs to be reflected in risk assessments, and also in terms of the prioritization of interventions need to be adjusted or according to that. Then in terms of this indicator of risk and severity, there needs to be better evidence base on this in terms of for all wildlife, for all types of harm that arise from wildlife trafficking that I've just mentioned. In terms of using hybrid indicators to really make sure that there's a combination of measures of the different harms in wildlife crime prevention and reduction strategies, so that these may lead to the emergence of new priorities, both in terms of species, but also in terms of geographies or commodity types. And very important, of course, the proportionality of the criminal justice responses. We've found, based on some limited evidence that we had access to, that enforcement efforts sometimes targets more lower level criminals, sometimes with very severe sanctions, while some of the higher level players are never identified or rarely identified. And perhaps, or even if they are, they don't necessarily receive as severe sanctions. So, of course, the proportionality of responses is very important. In terms of drivers, I would emphasize that the perpetrators or the people or players who engage in illegal wildlife trade activities at the different parts of the trade chain, at source, in trade, and end markets, can have very different motivations for engaging, and there can be a diversity of motivations. And we've also identified that this basically wildlife crime is not really a homogeneous. We shouldn't really think about it as a homogeneous sort of market and one monolithic block, but it really consists of multiple markets. For example, the characteristics and the drivers that are present in a market that's, for example, for food, is very different from a market that is targeting live animals or plants for the specialist market, where, for example, rarity is very important, and this is what is really sought. So we have found evidence of organized crime continuing to profit from large wildlife trafficking operations at particular points in the trade chain, but we also have found participants who are more opportunists, driven by basic needs for income. And in their case, of course, these profit-related motives may not always predominate, or at a different scale. Of course, traffickers try to exploit and are successful sometimes in exploiting inconsistencies and weaknesses in regulation and enforcement. And of course, there's other factors that shape, for example, gender and corruption, obviously playing a criminal role and an enabler of wildlife trafficking. So in terms of reactions to this, sometimes regulatory interventions could actually foresee and provide preemptive actions where it's obvious that the loss of economic opportunities for people impacted by the new regulation, and especially those that have very limited livelihood alternatives, this could be really considered and potentially addressed in advance to avoid illicit activities to be too appealing to continue. Then and this is perhaps another element, is more coherence and harmonization across the trade chain. If we think back to the ivory example that I showed before, this importance of similar regimes, regulatory regimes being in place from sourcing through transit to the consumer markets in terms of severe regulations or bans on trading or sale or so forth can be very important, because otherwise these can be exploited. Perhaps what I could also single out is more the sector-specific corruption vulnerabilities, because that are really linked to wildlife trafficking or specific to wildlife trafficking, and these relate to, for example, some public sector roles regarding harvest permitting, permit issuance, or trade permit issuance. These require further attention. In terms of seeking evidence of what works to reduce wildlife crime, again, we looked at multiple points in the trade chain. Overall, the available evidence is relatively weak on this. This is what we found, and that there's a lot of work to be done to build this evidence base, because of course, obviously, this is very important to understand in what works in decreasing wildlife crime. But we have some examples of or some evidence and proof on what seems to work. And these include, for example, patrolling, multi-track interventions, and responses involving both supply and demand side of the trade chain. And of course, we can draw on evidence from other crime sectors and best practice approaches there. And yes, and we need to improve M&E monitoring and evaluation and data collection in a structured way around these issues. So yeah, that's already leading into my first point. So really improving this evidence base and also understanding both the direct results of interventions, but also the impact on crime levels or the associated harms. So for example, the population levels of particular species, if possible. It would be great to develop more data standards to make sure there's more interoperability across different data sets. Yes, and obviously such an evidence collection and data collection that needs to be a longer term work, which requires investment and time. And it's very important also to share best practices and lessons learned from this. And really just to recap, it's basically very much the same as I've said before. I'm not going to repeat myself in the interest of time. I believe I'm already over. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please let me know now or later. And back to you, Luke.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katalin. Really interesting presentation. And yeah, completely agree with the need to share information and collaboration. That's exactly what we're trying to do through forums like this and other activities of the Alliance. So really important issue. Questions. I mean, on the previous webinar, we had I4, and they were talking about some of the digital aspects of the illegal wildlife trade. So I guess, I mean, how concerned are you by the kind of growth of digital platforms as a driver and a place where these crimes can take place? Thanks.
So digital platforms are very important, obviously, these days, and they require, just like other marketplaces, regulation, control, and also, well, basically policies to make sure that they're not exploited. So definitely these sort of the bigger and growing importance of these digital platforms comes with challenges that need to be overcome. And some of these include, for example, the more extensive use of private messaging platforms for enclosed groups, which might be more difficult to penetrate or even to even understand, because it's a bit of a more closed environment, so more difficult to monitor with open methods, so to say. So here, the importance of law enforcement engagement and intelligence-led interventions are particularly important.
Great. Thank you very much. We've got a few questions to get through. So now I'm going to go to a question from Raphael, who's the Africa Program Manager for EIA. He's asking, how can we enhance CITES to kind of better hold accountable those parties that are refusing to comply with the convention? Thanks.
So, I mean, it's really a fantastic opportunity that CITES has both the carrots and the sticks to incentivize good implementation and enforcement of the convention. It's not something that's necessarily available to other conventions. So I mean, that's just maybe to start off with that. And I think, like, as I mentioned, the carrots and the sticks, it's very important to find a good balance of providing support to be able to do proper implementation and enforcement, and really building the capacity and providing the tools that are required. And this is what UNODC is also trying to do as an organization, to provide such support at the relevant parts of the enforcement chain, from detection and forensic analyses and capacities to prosecution through investigation, of course. So engaging with prosecutors, but judges as well, and making sure that this happens. And obviously there is a role to play for CITES in all of this, and we collaborate very closely with CITES, among others, as part of the International Consortium to Combat Wildlife Crime.
Great, thank you for that answer. Two more quick questions and then we'll move on to our final presentation. But Scott Hajos from the National Whistleblower Centre, he's asking if you could just comment on the role of whistleblower protections and rewards when it comes to combating wildlife crime. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Very important issue and a big problem, and an increasingly growing problem or concerning problem, that this is not being addressed, or there's not sufficient protection for whistleblowers in several places. So that's definitely something that needs to be recognized, the role of whistleblowers in informing law enforcement action, and also the policymakers, to make sure that the relevant regulatory environments and policies are ensured.
Great, thank you. And then we'll go to one quick question before we move on from Anne-Marie Whedon. And she's just picked up on your point about how some enforcement techniques were predominantly targeting low-level wildlife crime offenders. Aside from social harms of inequitable targeting, what impact do you think this has from a deterrence perspective in the longer term?
Yes, so we had some prisoner interviews that we conducted in Indonesia in collaboration with the Indonesian Prison Service. That's really looked into and probed this issue with wildlife crime offenders in Indonesia, and we did some details of this, some information about this is included in the report in several sections, and we are planning to publish a dedicated research brief with more detailed in-depth findings from this research. And well, I mean, one element that we found is that some people, some of the offenders or people who have been incarcerated found that they received, well, we found that they received actually quite harsh sentences, and many of them were first-time offenders. And they have felt a lot of severe consequences of this socially, in terms of their how they are perceived by their communities and so forth. And so in that sense, there is this sometimes very severe sanctioning. On the other hand, the other part, we found that some others didn't feel any negative consequences of their incarceration. There was even one individual who suggested that they continued their illegal wildlife trade business from prison. So there, obviously, deterrence hasn't really worked, has it? So, I mean, these are absolutely questions that need better understanding and further probing, and that's we're planning to also continue looking into this area.
Great. Yeah, I'm sure you guys are the best place to do that research and ask those questions. So looking forward to seeing what you can come up with going forward. Look, thank you so much for that presentation. Really interesting. Again, highly recommend everybody to go and read those reports and the World Wildlife Crime Report. Excellent piece of work and very helpful for our own activities. Thank you so much. I do now need to move on. We're going to talk to Jade Saunders, who's the Executive Director of World Forest ID. And as many of you will know, consumer demand for timber and agricultural commodities expressed through global supply chains is creating unprecedented pressure on forest landscapes. And World Forest ID are working at the intersection of science and law to create the data and tools necessary to support policy initiatives, including those focused on illicit trade, to have, to make a real world impact. And World Forest ID, I think they are having an impact every week. I seem to see they're in another international media platform, so they're doing great work. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Jade Saunders to tell us a bit more.
Thank you very much, Luke. I hasten to add, we're not just doing media work, we are actually doing testing. It's just that at the moment it seems to be a rash of journalists who are interested in what we're up to. So it's all fun and games. So thank you for the invitation to talk. I feel like I should also thank UNODC, since there are two of you. It feels like a sort of joint thing, but yeah, thank you, WRI. I should just note that Chip is on the board of World Forest ID, and very much appreciated part of the governance structure for World Forest ID. So we have worked closely with WRI. But I think what I want to talk about here is super micro. That's one thing I should say straight up. You've heard all of these global pictures for the basket of all types of crime. This is very much about creating the data necessary to make supply chains that connect to forests transparent. And we do that to help enforcement agents, but we also do it to help companies. We also do it to help particularly FSC, which is one of the founding organizations of World Forest ID. So I'm going to talk about the way that we create that data and the way that we work, and then I'll talk about a couple of cases that we've worked on. So we're going from the super high level to right down in the weeds on individual supply chains and cases. So what is World Forest ID, apart from clickbait at the moment for a couple of excitable journalists? We are a US registered 501c3. So we're a non-profit, and we create data and tools necessary to make forest connected supply chains transparent, by which we're looking at, by which I mean we're always looking at origin, location of harvest, traceability, geolocation, all of these buzzwords that have been knocking around in the policy sphere recently. Essentially, it comes down to this plant, this tree that I've taken out of a shipping container or off the, a retail shelf. Where did it grow? What can its chemistry tell me about where it grew? We create non-proprietary reference data, by which I mean we are creating a reference data set that multiple laboratories in multiple countries can plug into. And that's really quite new. That hasn't been done before. All of our data, every time we analyze a big bunch of physical samples, and I'll talk about our pipeline shortly, all of our data, we do replicability testing with multiple labs to make sure they can all get the same measurements off the samples. And we combine that unique new chemical data set that we're creating from all of these samples from forests and farms with environmental data to create the most granular, the most accurate and precise real world knowledge that's actionable for the people who are making decisions about those supply chains, whether that's a buyer or an enforcement agent or a certification scheme. since we're on this particular webinar, we also work directly with enforcement agencies to create the tools and protocols and norms that can be used in regulatory cases, can be used to support other evidence or whatever in individual legal cases. We are part of a growing consortium. We ourselves are a non-profit, and a growing group of research institutes, all public research institutes, government research institutes, universities around the world are coming on board and being part of the creation of this data set. There is a slide, next slide, I'm not going to read out. It'll be in the pack for anyone who wants to circulate, but given that we're a bit tight on time, this is how we work. Who does what within that consortium? So how do we create this data? We send people out, as I said, into forests and farms with an app, with an increment borer, with a pack, with a barcode to collect samples of either core samples out of trees and leaves and other identifiers for those trees, or it could be a cocoa pod, it could be a soybean or a handful of soybeans, it could be any number of other commodities or products that are in these forest connected supply chains. We have a huge project on shrimp, looking at shrimp traceability as a driver of coastal deforestation. So that's why this slightly unwieldy phrase of forest connected supply chains. But essentially it all begins with the taking of physical samples from a specific GPS point with an app that has a few widgets built into it to ensure that that sample is actually taken where we think it is by someone that we know, and with a barcode and a set of information about it that allows us to move on to the next stage of the process. So the next stage of the process is that sample will be shipped, and good Lord, you will have no idea how much time I spend dealing with shipping logistics with my team. This is probably one of the most complicated bits. But anyway, once they've been shipped to one of our consortium partners, so one of the research institutes, they get accessioned into what we call the geolocated sample collection. So all of our samples go in there, and that means that we've got a kind of future-proofing if things go into legal processes or if amazing new techniques arrive. Wherever possible, we maintain fiber from every sample. It's not always possible because some of the samples end up being a bit small, but wherever possible, we do. Then they go on to laboratories. At the moment, we're focusing on 2 chemical techniques because we believe that they are the most effective in terms of allowing you to get a handle on processed wood products and processed commodities. And they are the most kind of targeted within the spatial range. There are other techniques, people use population genetics, various other things, but we have found that these are the tightest in terms of the variability in the spatial range, which is what allows us to get down to a certain land area for a traded product, if that makes sense. If you've got lots of variability of the chemistry in the landscape, you can start to look for these fingerprints that you can match to products that come out of trade. So we use trace element analysis and stable isotope ratio analysis. But all together, that basically means you have a GPS point, you have a physical sample, and off that physical sample, you can take 5 stable isotope ratios and up to 30 trace element values. And that gives you a lot of data to model in a landscape. For anyone who's thinking, what the hell is this? The way that I think about it, because I'm not a scientist, is each one of those chemical values is like a topography line on a map. So you have a 2-dimensional map, but you can tell what's a valley and what's a mountain. So essentially, we're building topography lines for all of this chemistry in a landscape model, and you can tell where's a high level of oxygen, where's a low level of oxygen, where's a high level of strontium, where's a low level of strontium. That's all in the back end of the modeling work that we do. We are taking all of that chemical data, and then we're building these landscape models that I've started to talk about a little bit. We call them spatial models. And all of that spatial modeling work is being peer reviewed. So we are going through peer review process. That's part of being a non-profit. That's part of this commitment to non-proprietary measurements and also non-proprietary evaluation models. This one was out last year. We have 2 more in the pipeline at the moment that we hope to get submitted before the end of the year. You know, the peer review process can be slow, but fingers crossed. But that's the ambition, is that all of our evaluation models will be peer reviewed. As Luke said, we've had some very exciting, recently very exciting media, excitable journalists picking up these stories. I want to mention, I kind of want to mention this because, of course, we're here talking about nature crime, and this is really not nature crime. This is about sanctions. This is economic crime, right? It's linked to a security imperative. The reason that we ended up in the situation we're in, which I'll come back to shortly, is that when we had done lots of small pilot projects, but we never had the funding to scale this. So we believed that this could actually give you an insight into forest landscapes and into the supply chains that come out of them. That's really, you know, we all know that there's paperwork all over the place, but a really objective look into that relationship between the product and the origin claim we believed it was powerful, but we never had the money to scale it. And then when Russia invaded Ukraine, we were suddenly able to access security money, which is orders of magnitude bigger and faster than environmental money. And I'll get onto that in a minute. But that's why we've been able to scale and why there's been this focus on Russian wood. We have now, having proved concept with all this, we have now got the funding secured to do something similar for a couple of Amazon Basin species and a couple of Congo Basin species, or Congo and West African species of timber. So there'll be more, and this becomes more relevant to the environmental crime discussion as we move forward. But I just want to kind of clarify that if people are looking at it and thinking this is talking about sanctions, because in the end, from the scientific perspective, it's all the same question. So we also work to try and translate the science into policy for impact. One of the things that I've observed coming from working with enforcement officials and now working with scientists is how much of a disconnect there is between those two communities. You know, you'll have a policy person who's thinking about the vast majority of the trade in forest products, which is processed, and they'll say to a scientist, can you track this back? And the scientist says, yes, thinking you're talking about logs, back to one stump in one concession in one tiny, you know, not a kind of scalable global solution that's going to really like change dynamics in big trade, kind of big, you know, big supply chains or big trades. So I think that's another piece of what we're doing, is really trying to be transparent, but also to kind of translate between these kind of communities and silos. So there's a couple of cases that we've done that have reached the end of the process. We've got a couple more that I can't really talk about. These are situations where the regulator has come to us. So these are both regulatory agencies. They're responsible for the EU timber regulation, which is the environmental sanction, the environmental piece of law, but they're also trying to handle the flow of Russian wood around the EU and other consumer you know, other blocks. It's in most markets, let's face it, because it's 12% of global supply, and 12% of global supply doesn't disappear overnight. So they're trying to handle that. They have evidence either from their own risk screening, from their own customs data, or from a dossier that's given to them by NGOs, and they want to know if the science can help them to reinforce that. One of the things that I have learned working with prosecutors for a really long time is that no prosecutor wants to go into court with one piece of evidence, because that is a lot of work and expense that if that one piece of evidence falls over, their case goes down the pan. So they're coming to us to ask if we can help support them. And in these two cases, we were able to give evaluations of the origin claim of the wood. And both of them ended up, I think I heard that the Belgian one, actually, the wood was later released, which was a kind of interesting scenario. And it shows how important, you know, solid laws are. You can build all the science you want, but if the legal process doesn't hold together, then it doesn't matter what you can demonstrate with the science. But yeah, these were but 2 examples where we were supporting enforcement officials to go through that process. And we were also informing them about the science, because this stuff all changes fairly frequently. What the science can do, what the reference data covers, they're kind of separate things. So I think that it's really important to be clear that the science is solid and it can do this, but it can only do it up to the point where the current reference data ends. And that's a challenge. But our reference, we're working with more and more different people now. It's been really interesting looking at who's willing to come to the table with marginal investments. Now we have this backbone of data. So we've had companies who want the data to cover a new country because they're concerned about their import claims there. There's no point them making data for that one country, but they can get the benefit of the whole data set if they add that one country to our data set. So they're funding the expansion of our data set. That's not to say they're submitting samples. We're sending independent sample collectors out, all of the rest of it, but they are funding the expansion in different directions because people can see the marginal benefit of expanding the current data set for them. I want to balance that by saying that we also are doing some really interesting work with individual companies who are starting to see both the power of the technology, the power of the science, and also the writing on the wall. I know that it is not a great time to be invoking the EU deforestation regulation, given that it's just been delayed and it's a bit wounded. But nonetheless, there was a really, if anyone looked in the enforcement section of that, I think it was Article 18, it specifically mentioned DNA and chemical testing as a tool that regulators could use to scrutinise species and origin claims in due diligence paperwork. The US Lacey Act, the most recent compliance plan for the US Lacey Act, for a US Lacey Act case has just come out, specifically mentions isotopes as a due care instrument. So I think companies are realising that this science is increasingly mature, and this is probably the best, if regulators are using it, then it makes sense for them to get on board and start using it themselves before they get caught out. So we've been working with WWF to pull together a group of companies who are interested in having a look at their supply chains, and we've got 3 current pilot projects, one looking again at birch, one looking at some Congo Basin species, and one looking at some Amazon Basin species. So I don't think there are any companies on this call. I had a quick scan through, but if there are any companies, or you know any companies and you'd like to get involved, please do reach out to me around this. I noticed that EIA was on the call. I'm always happy to talk to NGOs about how this science can empower their substantiated concerns as well. So I want to talk about very quickly, I know we're a bit tight for time, and I do want there to be questions, or at least the scope for possibility of questions. I want to talk about some challenges for an organization. I've UNODC is like the big beast, and the elephant, and we're the ant. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the challenges, because we are we are a very new non-profit, and it's really hard, I have to say, to find the resources to do these cases. There's no funding for cases in our world at all. I was saying to Chip and Luke that we even run tests for enforcement agents sometimes out of our own overhead funding, because they don't have the resources, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the sets of challenges is about like an ecosystem challenge, and that's why the presentations that came before were super interesting to me, because what I'm trying to do with my team, with the consortium, and with the enforcement officials and investigators and prosecutors we work with or are connected to, is try to align the scientific inquiry with the legal mandate, with a champion who really wants to use that legal mandate. And that's That's not easy. That's a tough one. That's like corralling the scientists who want to, you know, knowledge for knowledge's sake. They want to understand all of the things and do all of the research. And I'm like, no, let's come over here and do this bit first. Finding the legal mandate. There's no point creating, like the log example I made this morning. It's great to create science around logs, but if it's not logs ending up in the countries that are going to enforce the laws, then you need to think about the science for the processed products, because there's no point creating a scientific tool for enforcement officials if there isn't the resource or the political will or the legal mandate to use it. And then finding champions, building trust and clear communication. I come back to that thing I was saying about the disconnect in language and understanding between the scientific community and the legal community. It's really real, and I think that there's been some difficult history there where they're not understanding each other, and one feels that the other might be overclaiming or whatever. So that's, I mean, I've worked with investigators, regulators and prosecutors since 2012. So I've got a good network, but it's only that network that I facilitated who work on these particular laws that were designed to tackle the trade in illegally harvested timber. There's plenty more people out there that I think could benefit from this. The obvious one is CITES. And yeah, I'm open to those conversations. We have a tiny team, but with whatever resource we have, we're happy to talk to you. Sample collecting challenges. As I said, the primary, like the base of all of this at the moment is the physical samples, and we are creating unique primary data. That's expensive and challenging, and we're doing it at a unique scale. Like, this is not usual to collect these huge swathes of samples across landscapes. And that means we're facing some really unique challenges. Obviously, the cost of getting all these samples, getting them through the labs. Collector security. There are some really difficult places in the world where you don't want to send someone out. We're talking about Russian timber. That's the obvious one. There's areas in, you know, the north of Colombia. You don't want to be sending collectors. So, but that kind of access to boots on the ground, or willingness to put boots on the ground, is a challenge. It means that we have gaps in our data, and they can be really important gaps. And political cooperation is the last one. There are more and more controls over the physical movements of samples. You know, rightly controls over the extraction of bioresources and the whole biopiracy kind of challenge. But that also means that scientific samples, the kind of thing that we're moving around, are increasingly difficult to move around. Now, machine learning can be a game changer. It can fill those gaps. If you can sample all around a gap, then you don't need much, and you've got environmental information from satellites and weather data and whatever in the gap, then you can start to fill out that hole in your data, which is a really important thing to do. But if you want to make that workable with legal institutions, you have a bit of a challenge, because you have to be able to communicate what that means and for them to feel confident. And the final one is funding challenges. As I said, disconnect between the level of funding for security and the level of funding for nature crime. None of this would have existed if it wasn't for that large pot of money that we were able to access around the invasion of Ukraine. How do we scale the ambition to fund these tools for environmental reasons? Misalignment of funding and legal mandates. One government ministry has the money, one government ministry has a law they want to enforce, and it's very difficult to get those two things to fit together. And the inflexibility of the funding that generally is available. I invoke my overhead example, and I know there are funders on this call who are extremely tight with their overheads, and if there isn't a bit of flexibility in funding, it's really hard to make stuff happen. I think that's it. These are all of the people that support us, a couple of whom are on this call.
Great.
Thank you. I'm sorry if I went over too long.
But thanks so much, Jade. Look, we are over, but there's still a lot of people on the call, so thank you to those who have stuck with us. Look, we're over anyway. This is being recorded. It's going to be on the website, so we will. If you want to stay on the call, you're happy to do so. But if you have to go to other engagements, then that's absolutely fine. We're going to carry on though with a couple of questions. So first of all, Jade, thank you so much. And look, you know, I mentioned the media stuff because I'm a comms person and that excites me, but it really is important. Like the Nature Crime Alliance, we want to raise political will. We need to get this issue into the media more. So, you know, the work that you're doing on media is really useful for all of us. So it's you know, keep on doing it, I say, and I think it reflects the impact that you're having, even as a smaller organization. I do have a couple of questions. There's a technical question here from Puyi Wong, who's asking, is it possible to trace palm oil that's been harvested from plantations that have caused deforestation?
And the answer is I don't actually know. Both palm oil and rubber move around the world as liquids, and that means that we have a very different methodological challenge to the one that we have for timber and soy and cocoa and coffee, and even shrimp. So I have asked, we don't have the funding to find out that at the moment. We had some very tiny pilot project funding to see if we could take samples and create a protocol for the collection of samples, but we haven't had the scaled funding. I suspect it's possible. Well, it will be possible. The challenge will be the level of accuracy. So if you can get to, you know, 1,000 kilometers versus 100 kilometers, that makes a huge difference in terms of what can be achieved from an enforcement or a policy perspective. So I think it's a research question. What I do know is that a lot of the same scientific techniques are used for wine and honey and oils, and it is possible in those sectors to use regulatory science to get a handle on what's been added to them or where they've come from. So I guess there's cause to be, there's reason to be optimistic, but I don't want to overpromise.
Great, thank you for that answer. One final question then before we go, and you've touched on some of this, but we often hear when I go to events and meetings that there's some reticence sometimes between law enforcement organizations wanting to engage with nonprofits and NGOs. Not always. There's some examples of things working really well together, but occasionally World Forest ID is obviously doing this very effectively. So given the members of the Nature Crime Alliance and other stakeholders on this call, what advice would you give to people who are trying to build those relationships with law enforcement? Because you've been doing it so successfully.
A great question. Yeah, I think these people, they know nonsense. They smell nonsense, particularly the prosecutors. So I think consistently over a long-term period, being credible and honest with them. I know that's like motherhood and apple pie. Like, of course, we're all credible and honest. But, there is a lot of sort of ideological kind of conversation in the NGO sector. And I think that can sometimes be difficult for law enforcement officials to take seriously. So like really, the dynamic of advocacy, we're all mission driven, I get it, but the dynamic of advocacy can alienate them. So really understanding the difference between evidence and inference, understanding the timelines of legal processes, understanding, like I said, no prosecutor wants to go into court with only one piece of evidence. So yes, you may have rocked up with a great piece of evidence, but they might not be able to do anything with it, or they might not feel comfortable to do anything with it. Like understanding their challenges. And I mean, I think, I don't know, maybe I'm a bit naive, but I've always, with the tree process, I've always come from the perspective that these are good people who are working as hard as they can to try and enforce the law. It's complicated law. They're in difficult situations politically. They don't necessarily have the backing of the higher ups and all the rest of it. But I think if you come at it from that perspective, rather than like, these are idiots who don't care and they're not working hard enough and everything, I think that's been a very successful strategy for me, because generally these are people who care.
Great. Thank you for those words of advice, Jade, and I hope it was of value to people on the call. We have had some last-minute questions, but I really do think we have to wrap up. We're 15 minutes over. We can put those questions to Jade, and we can contact the individuals directly with answers from Jade. So thank you so much. All that remains is to say thank you to our experts who have joined us today, and thanks to Chip. Thank you to Emily Vale from World Resources Institute, who's been producing this webinar from behind the scenes. And don't forget, we've got a webinar next week, Civil Society and COP16. That's all about how CSOs can make the most of their presence at the CBD COP if they are attending. That should be really good. That's on the 9th of October. More information on naturecrimealliance.org. So thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your days and see you all soon.